Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, and theater. And today is absolutely no exception as we're joined by the fantastic Ryan Michelle Bathe to talk all about her latest movie, Sylvie's Love. And the first thing that I was really interested in and wanted to ask about was in terms of like Eugene Ash, who wrote and directed the movie, music and blues music is like such a central ethos and feel to the movie and really influences a lot of the rhythm and the pacing of the film. And with your character, she's not necessarily in any of the scenes that have music directly, but I was interested in whether that still informed anything in terms of your performance and your character, or even just kind of like the tone that you thought about in developing and crafting her, knowing that that was such an important, vital part of the personality of this film.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think so because I don't think I had to because it was because of the way the music was layered in.
Mhm.
Every performance then becomes a part of this symphony that they created. And
Mhm.
like jazz is such a metaphor for the movie. Jazz is in the movie, and then of course the way in which their lives become intertwined and they sort of can't live without each other. Sort of love,
Mhm.
becomes in and of its in its own way sort of a song that they kind of improvise on, and they finally,
Mhm.
sometimes they're in sync, sometimes they're not. So I think that, in watching the film you really can pluck out every character in their own sort of syncopation. So I don't think
Mhm.
I thought about it while we were actually in the scenes, but it definitely in the editing and then directing and just the mood of the film for sure.
Mhm.
That you
And
get through.
yeah, and one of the interesting things that I think he does, and one of the things that's great is like it really is just kind of like the central character piece. But obviously, we know with the time period that the movie takes place that there was so much going on politically and culturally in the background, but it's not central to the plot. But again, I was interested in whether that had any impact on the way that you thought about your character and any of the choices that you made, knowing that that would be part of her life experience outside of the scenes where we see her.
I mean, no more so than, there's never been a time period for African Americans where it's quiet. Like there's
Mhm.
never a century or a decade where there isn't some sort of fight or struggle or,
Mhm.
and I think for other people, the civil rights movement was such a tumultuous time in the country, and it was, but I don't know that it was so much more tumultuous than any other time for African American people in this country. And when
Mhm.
I speak to people who lived through it or lived, they were like, yeah, it was always in the background, but everything was always in the background, you know. And unless you were right there in the center in Birmingham, or you chose to get on a bus and go fight, and
Mhm.
go march and all of those things, I think for Black people the struggle is just an everyday thing that you have
Mhm.
to deal with. So I don't know that again, like I said, I talked to my grandmother years ago and about the civil rights movement, and the impact was very different than I think we're told the impact was,
Mhm.
in the sense that when we watch movies about that time or TV shows about, that's all it is. It's
Mhm.
just this overwhelming, pervasive thing that,
Yeah.
and it was and it wasn't. It was in the sense that, obviously everybody was fighting for this, but it wasn't in the sense that this was, it wasn't any different in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the
Yeah.
70s and all the way up to today. There's some sort of fight, there's some sort of march, there's some sort of something that we're always engaged in.
Yeah. No, that absolutely makes sense when you describe it that way. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the way that you kind of construct and build out your character because, in the lens of the film, we only get the opportunity to see her within the workplace. But obviously, there's so many more details that you're bringing in through your performance. So I wanted to ask about what that looks like in terms of the construction of who she is and figuring out the layers and how much life experience you personally find it helpful to build beyond what we see in the scenes on screen to bring that into your performance in that way.
Oh, tons and tons and tons.
Mhm.
Like what where is she from? Where did she go to school? Especially in that time. And that's like the fun part, where, I had this idea about, she obviously went to college and different things in the script informed it. Like, so her Sylvie's mother runs a finishing school, and I don't think we realized that those were pretty popular, back then. They were popular in the 40s and 50s, and I think, my character probably would have gone to, in the early 50s, a finishing type of school, because of that world. I sort of was like, oh, that's interesting. I'll pull from that. I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if Sylvie and Kate, one of the reasons why they are so simpatico is because they do come from the same world. What if my character did come from a similar sense of like propriety and properness and how to carry oneself, and and that's one of the reasons why she sees something in Sylvie that's that reminds her of home, or reminds her of the people that she knows, and one of the reasons why she feels that she can trust her. So the script definitely informed that. I probably would have made a different choice. I may have made a different choice if, the character of Sylvie had been a little bit more scrappy, and, maybe I would have, but there is something about the two of them that kind of is an instant kind of connection. And that makes me wonder, why is it such an interesting instant connection? And it's usually because you have a shared background, even though you might not know it. But then there's like, oh, wait a minute, and in that time in New York, the fact that my character ends up marrying, Esquire, this lawyer, they all would have known if Kate and Sylvie didn't know each other prior to, once they sort of dug into, I'm sure my fiance knows her father, and like there's it's 6 degrees, so those are the choices that I made based on the script.
Yeah. How about choices based around her relationship? Because we see her make a choice not to renew her contract and continue being a producer at this TV station because she's getting engaged, which seems like almost a surprising choice for someone who's worked so hard to get to where they are. So how did that construct into the way that you imagined her relationship being, and what would have led into that specific choice so that you could bring it into that moment when she tells Sylvie?
Back then, women were so defined by wife, mother, that kind of status, that in and of itself was the status, right? And I don't know that, we never see Kate, I don't know that Kate has the same drive and love for television that Sylvie has. I like to think that Kate loves to work, and she maybe found herself in this position. I mean, because think about it, television was very new back then. It's not like now where we have to sort of like, there's a way to do things. I mean, it was a new thing. I'm sure, there's some, the Lucy Wilbur cooking show that was, a local show, just the tri-state area. I'm sure there was a way of like falling into those jobs back then when something was so new. I mean, think about the internet or things that developed in our lifetime, where people, you'll be talking to somebody and they're like, yeah, I know a girl. I went to Stanford, and a girlfriend always reminds me of this. And, she had some friends who were starting this thing, and they wanted her to invest. And, her mother and father had some money, and she was like, well, it sounds good. $10,000 is a lot. She's like, I just don't know about that name. I mean, what is Google? To this day, she's like, I would have been a quadruple billionaire. Like, what was I thinking? But, it's kind of those, and if she had said, it would have been a total just falling into something because you went to school with some people who knew. So that's how I sort of envisioned for Kate, like she kind of fell into this because it was such this new thing, maybe she, majored in this new thing called communications. I mean, we just assume that these are majors that they had back then, but maybe what if she was the first in the first class that offered something like that? You know what I mean? So for me, I think she likes the idea of working, but I don't know that it is the same passion for television. And I think that maybe it was time for her to get another level of status, because let's face it, in her community, she probably didn't have the status of a husband and children and all of those things. And now she has the opportunity to do that. And, it's kind of like my mom. My mom is the type of person, she'll be in it for however long. And then one day she wakes up and she just doesn't want to do that thing anymore. And then it's over. And I'm like, you spent 10 years playing tennis. And she's like, yeah, I'm done. So I think I kind of thought of Kate as that type of person, like, oh, I'm done with that. And I'm on to the next thing. And those people who are a little bit detached, whereas Sylvie, we see the movie through the lens of Sylvie, who's so passionate and attached to like her love and, her love of television. And I don't know that Kate is that kind of woman. I think she's a little bit like, oh, time for something else.
I love it so much. And I'm like interested to go back and watch those scenes with that lens on it now and thinking about it in that way, because I was so intrigued by that choice. And I wanted to also talk a little bit about the way that you kind of embody the physicality and those elements of her, because obviously, whenever you're doing a period piece, you have kind of like the richness of costume and hair and makeup in a very different way. And which kind of like, what do you find are the physical aspects of that sort of realm that you find the most useful for kind of like figuring out who this character is? How are they going to move? How are they going to speak? Kind of like, how are they going to walk into a scene?
The undergarments, because that's the clothes themselves. Yes, they have you move differently, but there was such a layering to what they did. We don't have that same layering. There was a dressing before the dressing. That we just don't do. I mean, maybe we'll throw on a bra or something, but we certainly don't have like the proper undergarments. And they did that regardless of how big or little you were. You had, it wasn't like, I'm going to throw in some Spanx today. Like, it was like, they had a whole, I can never forget my grandmother, we were somewhere and this woman walked by and, she was, my grandmother just looked at her and was like, see, that's why they invented girdles. You didn't get to wiggle as much. So like that really helps. Like and just just the process of getting dressed really puts you in the mindset of this is what this woman would do every single day and why and how important it was to wear certain things. And then you instantly carry yourself in a different way because you took so much time getting dressed that it's, you are in that thing and you're in it, and there's girdles and this and, and the clothes, they don't have stretch. They did not have stretch. There was no wool blend. It was wool. That was it. It was cotton. It was wool. There were no blends. There were no stretchy fabrics. So it was just, it was such a different way. And the shoes, interestingly enough, they're much more comfortable in a way because no one was wearing stilettos. Everything was a pump. So it's like, oh, these are a little bit more comfortable. So it was just, and stockings. I mean, I could go on and on and on, but all of that really does help you get into just like you said, the physicality of how they would sit and how they would stand and how they, the poise and everything. Like, we stand and we might slump a little bit, but they were always, just always ready and poised and standing correctly because of all the armor that went into dressing,
Yeah. I feel like I'm trying to sit up more straight now.
Yeah, me too. I'm like, oh yeah, I should,
In terms of the physical location of her office, I also found that to be a really interesting character detail because it's very scant in terms of what she has. She's clearly worked there for a while, but there's very few items on her desk. It's not kind of strewn with personal effects and everything behind her is like behind a closed door in a cupboard. Did that kind of give you any certain details on her as a character as well when you walked in and saw the way that location had been designed for you?
For sure. I mean, I definitely was like, oh, again, it's time. I'm sure there was something about the time period where people were just more formal, where you didn't bring, the silly picture of your family. I don't even know that they took silly pictures back then. But again, I definitely think, so the formality of it, right? Like the workplace was very much, it was just very formal. It was like back then going to church was very formal. All of it was very formal. So that informed like how that world worked again, and why she was so like Lucy Wilbur must, she has to present a certain way. And even in the background, she's all loosey goosey with the cigarettes and the dirty jokes. But I also think that I'm sure there was something to the fact that she was a Black woman at that
Mm-hmm.
time, she probably did keep it as sparse as possible so
Mm-hmm.
that there would never be any room for people to say anything about that's inappropriate or that shouldn't be there, whatever that is,
Mm-hmm.
I think that was, and the more, she probably didn't have very personal relationships with people because she
Mm-hmm.
probably had to keep it very, very businesslike, because being a Black woman at that time, even in this time, but being especially back then, I'm sure she couldn't invite familiarity, because familiarity could breed a certain sense of, I'm going to treat you the way in which I think Black women should be treated in this time period, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I think she probably had to work very hard. And her office is an example of like, no nonsense. I'm not going to invite
Yeah.
questions about, my family. I'm here to work. And when you see me as your boss, period.
Mm-hmm. Did that ingrained sense of formality that was such a requirement of her at the time also impact the way that you thought about the dialogue? Because I noticed, like, when you're delivering lines, there's such a specific and deliberate pacing and tone of voice. And even when she's giving directions and orders to someone, her voice is always at a very specific tone. So was that kind of the genesis of where that came from for you?
Very much so. Very, very much so. I very much, yes. And there's sort of it's not very many scenes obviously, but there's sort of an evolution in terms of like when that gets to fall away,
Mm-hmm.
and when she gets to, we see at the end that her and Sylvie have become friends because of the fact that she has dropped the me. She can now because it's not her office
Yeah.
anymore, but she can drop a certain sense of formality,
Mhm.
and that probably, to your one of your first questions, is probably why she's so willing to leave it. It's stressful. It's stressful not being able to be friends with people at work. It's
Mhm.
stressful not being able to, and as much as she got this amazing job, and she's a Black woman at the time, there are a lot of sacrifices that you have to
Mhm.
make to get to that point. And Sylvie was sort of in the opposite. She had her child early, she had already been married, so
Mhm.
she didn't have to face a world with those sacrifices, and a
Mhm.
way had been made for her, so she didn't have to ingrain and impress upon people, no, I am the boss, you will
Mhm.
treat me like the boss, like that all that work had been done, and that's
Yeah.
hard work.
Yeah.
So I definitely felt a sense of, like, for me as a character, a sense of relief, like
Mhm.
I can let this burden go. I can, we're so we have therapists, and we can go home and kick back and watch television and hang out with our friends and get on the phone and go have drink. Like, we have to remember, back then that wasn't quite like that. And yes, she was
Mhm.
living in New York, so there was probably, more to that. But if think about, if every single one of your friends,
Mhm.
none of them worked,
Yeah.
like not one. And by the time you were 30, every single one of your friends had 3 children and a
Mhm.
husband, and they all played bridge together, and they did it at 12 noon, and you could never participate. Like, you know
Mhm.
what I'm saying? Like, think about how
Yeah.
isolating that could be. So I definitely felt like, when I could, I tried to make my speech and my mannerisms a little less formal,
Mhm.
to show that there is a changing of the guard, and that as we move into the early to mid to late 60s, that things are starting to change. By the time we hit the 70s, I'm sure Sylvie's world, all of our worlds obviously look very
Mhm.
different, but the workplace looks very different too. So I tried to put, I mean, it's one scene with the ring, but I tried to have that layered in there, knowing that there's a future for both of them, and kind of trying to show in
Mhm.
that moment what that future looks like.
Yeah. And kind of to the point that you were making before about, how Kate really feels like she can't let people in and have a sense of familiarity, and kind of like needs to keep everything close to her chest as well. I thought that the blocking that Eugene utilizes to show that was really interesting as well. So wanted to ask about, kind of like the the physical kind of like movement and blocking within a lot of the scenes, particularly if you think about the scene where, you know, you've got Lucy, who's the host of the show, and she's there telling her dirty jokes, the one that you were mentioning before, to a bunch of white guys in suits. And then you look over and it's Kate and Sylvie kind of as onlookers, like in the corner. They're not active participants in what's going on. And it doesn't feel like they usually, you know, it's not like, oh, why are you standing over there? It's like, that's the dynamic that exists on this set. So how did you work with Eugene to think about like the physical blocking and how you could really use that to add so many enriched layers to it as well?
That kind of just happened. I mean, I think it was instinctual on all of our parts, you know, like I don't even think we talked about it, but it was just very much like, of course, do you know what I mean? We would be looking in on this. We would be spying in. Like, she would never allow, like, again, she doesn't want her to do it on screen, but she would never, neither one of them would allow themselves, even when later on, when we see Sylvie allowing her to be so kind of like a little bit more raunchy, she's like, she's still not a part of it. You know, she's still looking on. I mean, I also think that's the role of the producer in a way, you know, to be sort of like, to be the eye, you know, that kind of sees and kind of, you know, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's, you know, pulling it all together in a way. But so, yeah, I don't even think we talked about it, but it's great that you noticed that, because I think we just, you know, while we're sitting, we're kind of off in the dark, and they're sort of, you know, it just felt like, oh, this, of course, this is what we're supposed to be doing, you know? So
Yeah.
there was a lot of that though. Like, Eugene was just, there were a lot of moments we were all just so in sync that they just kind of happened like that. You know, no one had to say, it was like, it was even shorter than shorthand. You know, we all just kind of landed exactly where we were supposed to be so many times.
Yeah. There's also a moment in one of those scenes where they're on the production set of this cooking show that I thought told so much as well, where Kate's giving a detail to one of the crew about, okay, like, these are the ingredients I need. This is how I need them. This is where I need them. This is what's going to happen. And just like the level of meticulous detail that she gives. And then similarly, she turns to give Sylvie some directions to go out and buy some items that they're going to need. And it's like, not this, we want it this way. And it really just kind of struck me. And I was interested if kind of like the way that you thought about it was her being a woman, and particularly what you're saying about, you know, what she's had to go through as a Black woman, and the expectations on her of just like, this is a woman who can't let up, can never make a mistake, knows that when she walks into a room that every single detail has to be perfect because she can just never let up. Did you think about the direction of little moments like that coming from the genesis of that place?
Absolutely. You know, it's a small moment. We have to see that she is that meticulous, and that she's on top of it, and that she's, you know, and that she expects Sylvie to do this. Like, she doesn't coddle her in that moment, you know, and I think that she makes that choice to be that not harsh. I didn't want it to be harsh, but very much like, there's just no room to make a mistake. And I'm going to expect that you rise to this, you know, like, sort of matter of fact. I tried to make it cold, but matter of fact, you know, like, not, okay, Sylvie, honey, you're gonna go, you know what I mean? Like, you know, it wasn't that, because it's like, you're gonna make both of us look bad. And you know it, I know it, we don't have to say it, get it together, you know? So yes, there definitely, she couldn't make any mistakes. You know, Kate would not have been in that position where she's not incredibly meticulous. I like to think that, you know, I'm sure something happened back early in her career where, you know, she was the only person who dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, because she had to be so extra meticulous. And somebody was like, oh, had you not done that, this whole thing wouldn't have, you know, I like to think that that's probably one of the, you know, and she knew at that moment, like, I have to do this all the time and have this level, even on this, you know, cooking show. You know, so yeah.
Yeah. And it's so beautiful to watch that friendship and that kinship that she has with Sylvie. Like you were saying, even from the very first moment where Sylvie walks into her office to interview for the job, there's like an immediate connectivity between the two of them. And, you know, it's really lovely to watch the way that Kate immediately kind of like puts herself into a mentor position. You know, Sylvie never asks her for that. It's just like, this is what we're going to do. This is what you're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to go about it. And, you know, then when she kind of like hands her job over to Sylvie as well, did you think about what Kate's journey would have been like in terms of if she had ever had someone in her life that had done that, and that was kind of like something that she learned, or if it was something that was a bit of a gaping hole that she wished she'd had someone who could have done that for her?
I think when you're, especially back then,
Mhm.
you know, how do I put this? Black people are very familial with one
Mhm.
another. You know, it's like, you know, you're taught from a very early age that you have to look out for each other
Mhm.
because no one else is going to, whether you know them or not. And I think it goes back. I mean, it could go all the way back to slavery when, you know, new people would arrive on the plantation, and, you know, people had to adopt them as cousins or brothers or sisters or grandkids. You know, they had to, as a matter of survival, and then as a
Mhm.
matter of kinship, and if there was going to be any way to thrive, it was going to be together. And I think that that's such, it goes so far back. And so when
Mhm.
people, you know, again, when you mention the civil rights movement, again, it's like an everyday type of thing for us. It's like, if
Mhm.
you see someone at
Mhm.
school or at church, wherever, like, and it's just the two of you, you guys, you look out for that
Yeah.
person. You guys look out for each other, you know? And so I think it was just instant with in my mind, the minute Sylvie walks in the door, she wants her to succeed.
Yeah.
And she gets really lucky because she's smart and she's great and she's talented and she's all those things, and she's hungry, right? And so she
Mhm.
does all the things that she needs her to do. And so I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know that Kate wishes that she had had that, because again, it was such a new industry. There was no, I think so many people were the first, you know, she wasn't just the first. It was like, you know, 5 years ago was the very first producer ever. The very first cooking show was only 7 years ago, right? So I don't know that she sees it as something that she wishes that she had. I think she's just glad that she can hand it over to someone who looks like her, you know, who's well
Mhm.
trained, who she knows is only going to do the same thing for someone else, first of all, but also take it and make it even better, make the, you know, make the job even better, which she does.
Yeah. And then I also wanted to ask you about your own personal work as a producer and starting a production company that you've also just signed a first look deal with. And just in terms of like having the extensive experience that you do across film and across television, and the producers that you've had the opportunity to work alongside and collaborate with, you know, what you want to bring into your work as a producer and in developing content, and what's really important and vital to you in terms of the stories that you really want to shepherd and give the opportunity to come out into the entertainment landscape with this company.
You know, I think we're in a really good space where we can tell very specific and unique stories from different people's imaginations that maybe would not have gotten told, you know? And I think that the more people you have in a space, the more room you can make for those kinds of, like, I mean, who would have thought the Queen's Gambit? Gambit. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that somebody would have written a show about, I mean, you know, a girl in an orphanage with pills and chess. Like, you know what I mean? Like, how does that even work? I mean, something like Fleabag, but the more you have in this space, the more you can push out these incredible stories and the more space you make for other people. So I would like to think that, you know, we're going to just find these incredibly interesting shows and voices and ways into things, you know, again, that are very specific, but, you know, maybe we've seen them before, but it's just a different angle, or maybe we haven't seen this story before, you know,
Mhm.
but I'm interested in hearing all of it so that we can pick, like, which of these incredible slivers of imagination do we get to live in, you know? And that's kind of how I see it. It's such a privilege to be able to walk through someone else's imagination, you know? It's almost
Mhm.
like being able to go into somebody else's dream, you know, like, wouldn't that be, you know, and to see, oh my god, dreams are all the same, that's the weird stuff that happens in my dream, and, like, you know, and, like, because you think dreams are so bizarre, and they are, but, like, there's a commonality even, you know? So I think that's what I love the most. Like, oh my God, this is so bizarre, but also strangely familiar, you know, and such a privilege, like I said, to be able to walk through someone else's imagination. So I see it that way, that we're making space,
Mhm.
and we're inviting people into these, you know, quirky, weird, hopefully, but also weirdly familiar worlds.
Yeah. We have such a fantastic eye for like great story and great characters and the way that you approach them as an actor. So I'm so excited to see what you pull together as a producer as well. And thank you so much for talking with us all about the movie today.
Oh my God, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. You asked incredibly good questions.